Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today in Thun, Switzerland visiting B&T. And today we're going to take a look at the evolution of B&T's suppressors. This is one of the companies that isn't really so well known in the United States, which is a little bit unusual, a little odd, given that they are one of the dominant suppressor manufacturers in Europe. And in fact, they've been involved as OEM manufacturers for basically all of the major firearms manufacturers in Europe. Like the classic example here is the MP7, where the suppressor for the MP7 is a B&T can that was developed by HK, or developed with HK, hand in hand with B&T as the gun was being developed. The suppressor for it was being tuned at the same time. So, to begin with, B&T suppressors begin with Karl Brügger. And in the late 80s, early 90s, he's working at, well, mostly late 80s up to 91. He's working as a machinist, and he's working in a plant where they didn't really have enough work for the guys to do all the time. And the plant actually encouraged Brügger and his coworkers to, if there wasn't any official work to do, use the machines for your own projects. Like, go ahead, learn what you're doing, improve your skills, that sort of thing. And so Brügger, being a shooter and a gun guy, uses this opportunity to start manufacturing suppressors for himself and for his friends. At this point in Switzerland, suppressors are unregulated. You can buy and sell them completely without oversight. And so he starts making some cans, makes some for his friends, starts tinkering with different designs, experimenting with what works best. And in 1991, forms a company. This initially is a very small company. It's like 3 people to start with. And they start primarily making suppressors. And by 1991, the first official B&T can is out there. They're getting contracts. The first major contracts were with Swiss police agencies, which are fairly small, but still official government agencies. And the business only grows from there. Now, by this point, he had come up with what he calls a star baffle design. It's a baffle design that was machined, and it forms the core, literally and figuratively, for a lot of the initial B&T suppressors. In fact, for more than 10 years of B&T suppressors. So we'll take a look at that in just a minute, but while I have the full screen here, I wanted to show off a couple of items, namely this, which was a very early, very, very early, he's really embarrassed that I have it here on camera, but a very early submission for the Swiss military, because they do a lot of firearms training, often in populated areas, and back in the early 90s, they were looking for ways to reduce noise pollution from military training, militia training. And one of the ideas was we could put suppressors on the guns. And so this is classic Swiss Army intention here, where it's the largest volume possible. It's huge. It's impractically heavy for combat use, but it was only intended for range, marksmanship range training, where noise was the most important element. Now, ultimately, the Swiss at this point decide not to do it suppressors. They decide instead to build shooting tunnels, which perhaps wasn't the best long-term plan. They're probably actually going to end up going to suppressors now before too much longer. But early SIG 550 suppressor, that's pretty cool. There were some other early neat designs he had as well. Offset, square, wipe-based pistol suppressors. We'll take a look at this up close. But in fact, let's do that right now. Let's go. Okay, before we really get into the story, I do have to show you this. This is just one of the early, oh, let's try that. It's offset. This is for a pistol, of course. It's offset below the sight line so that you don't need special sights. And then, of course, this is the cutaway. It is a 4-wipe suppressor with a little spacer in between each one. Now, since it's an offset can, of course, you have to make sure that it indexes correctly, because you want it to line up like this, not like that, or definitely not like that. And so they did that simply by having a threaded adapter with a jam nut. So you screw this onto the barrel of the gun, the can screws onto this end, you get it aligned properly, and then you just tighten down the internal jam nut. So this is the sort of thing that wasn't ever contracted by any organization, but a bunch of these were sold privately in Switzerland. But moving on, the optimum baffle design that Brügger came up with was essentially this. He called it a star baffle. You've got 6 lobes in there, they're offset. You would be drilling holes through these. This is just a sort of a mostly manufactured example. And he took these baffles and machined them, which makes for a relatively expensive system. And that became the initial, sort of the first really successful standardized suppressor from B&T. Now this, and by the way, that suppressor is essentially still made and still offered today. This is the earliest, earlier simple version. It has a tri-lug adapter, and it was intended for submachine guns. There were a lot of police agencies using MP5s, and they had this sort of tri-lug adapter system. This is not an MP5, this is a B&T subgun, but same adapter method, and we just push this on, line it up, push it in, rotate it around till it locks behind those tri-lugs, and then you tighten it down, and presto, there you go. So this was fairly popular. So they took essentially the same design. This is an aluminum tube, and these star baffles inside are, can't really see down inside there, but the baffles on these, made from 9mm parabellum, are made out of aluminum, and then adapt the mechanism to include a Nielsen device, and this becomes a really good pistol suppressor. So the idea of a Nielsen device, you can see the spring here. This is captive inside the end of the suppressor, and when you fire, the suppressor body actually goes forward a little bit. The problem with suppressors on Browning-style pistols is that essentially they add a bunch of weight to the barrel. The barrel has to move in order for the pistol to reliably unlock and cycle, and if you put too much weight on them, they stop working right. So the idea here is to essentially balance it by deliberately using the back pressure of the suppressor to balance the system. Anyway, you add that in. By the way, the reason there's this crenellated design here is, this one's not been cleaned in a long time, but when you put this together, it is probably going to have some impact on your zero, and you can actually rotate the Nielsen device in the suppressor, line it up with wherever it works best, gives you the least change of zero. So that way, that's not a unique B&T thing, that's a common feature of this style of suppressor these days. Anyway, this is marketed as the Impuls 2A. It becomes a popular item for B&T starting, boy, the early versions of this are like 1992. By 1996, this pattern is in mass production. It remains in mass production today, and it was used all over the place. So these are sold all over the place. They have a bunch of different NSN numbers. They're used by OEMs, by a bunch of major companies. In fact, this is, I believe, the only suppressor that Glock specifically allows you to use on their pistols without voiding warranties. So you will, if you're looking around at historic suppressors in various military collections, you will often find Impuls 2As that are marked with other manufacturers' logos as well, because B&T acted as an OEM manufacturer. All right, now we come to what I think is probably the most recognizable B&T suppressor series, especially for Americans, perhaps, and that is the Rotex series. So this is a little bit of a complicated system to explain, but remember our star baffle here. The very first Rotex, it wasn't a Rotex number, we have a 2, a 3, and a 5 here, but the original Rotex was a design for US Special Forces Command, where they took these star baffles, machined them out of titanium, and submitted them with a rotary locking system like this. So if you look at this carefully, this is an eccentric cam. It comes in a little more on this side, which we can then rotate over to that side. This was set up for a specialized flash suppressor muzzle device that had a rim on the back end, and you could put it on this way, and then when you rotated this cap 180 degrees, the eccentric edge locked in behind the ridge. It was a very easy, quick detach sort of system. And so the original Rotex was titanium baffles, very lightweight, QD, and given the state of manufacturing technology at the time, this would have been pre-2004. Like, this was a really early, sort of very early GWatt design. It was too expensive even for the US military to purchase. So they kind of went back to the drawing board and they came up with instead the Rotex 3, where these, it's still star baffles, but now they're being machined out of stainless steel or Inconel. In a steel tube, you are essentially taking this original early design and beefing it up for 5.56 pressures instead of pistol caliber pressures. In addition, there was some complaint with this original rotary locking system that it locks eccentrically, so it's only holding on to one side of the muzzle device, and there's potential for this to cause zero shift because it's not held symmetrically. So that leads to a new NATO standard attachment method, and that's what we see on the Rotex 3s. There's a lot kind of going on here, but essentially what we do is lift this gate up. This will then lock down over a NATO standard birdcage flash hider, and then you can tighten the can down to prevent it from coming out. And then you also have, well, so this is your release button, push this in and you can unscrew the can, and then there's a release safety here so that you can't actually pull this back unless this safety is removed. It's interesting, this whole thing seems a little more complicated than necessary. This extra safety mechanism was specifically required by the Bundeswehr because they had a standard where they wanted to be able to shoot 1,700 rounds through the thing without it coming loose at all, which is like cool. That's an impressive standard to have, but it meant adding in some extra complexity that makes the cans a little tricky to use sometimes if you're not familiar with them. Anyway, all right, we're going to start by pulling in the release here, unscrewing the tube, make sure it's loose, then lift the gate up, pull that back, gate up, align this perpendicular to the flats on the flash suppressor, slide that in until it lines up. There we go. That snaps down. Then we tighten the tube back up. There we go. And then I managed to actually screw in the flash suppressor on this gun because it's not super tight. But there you have a very, lock that in place, a very solidly mounted 5.56 can. And the Rotex 3 series would go on to be adopted far and wide with NATO military and European and American law enforcement agencies. This is a can that got a reputation for being incredibly durable. It's remarkably quiet. The star baffles are a pretty darn quiet system, but they're also heavy and they're relatively expensive to manufacture because there's, as you can see, there's a lot of machining time that goes into each individual baffle stacked up inside this can. So they're available in a variety of different lengths, but this becomes one of the core elements in B&T's suppressor lineup. All right, fast forward a couple years to about 2009, and there's a desire for something lighter. This Rotex 3 is a bomb-proof can, like you can use it as a construction tool if you need it. But this 223 can also weighs 32 ounces. It's super chunky. And so B&T's clients want something that has the same durability but is lighter. And so the solution is to replace these star baffles, which are heavy, there's a lot of mass in here, and expensive at the same time, with simple conical baffles. So this example is a cutaway, totally destroyed can. But this is a Rotex 5, and you can see the change to just a simple stamped cone baffle. And that produces the Rotex 5. So suppressor design is all about trade-offs. This is not quite as quiet because those cones aren't quite as efficient at suppressing as the more complex star baffles were, but it's also less expensive and it weighs less. So like I can put this one on a scale, but it's not going to be a one-to-one comparison because it's a different length. This guy, instead of 33 ounces, is 23.7 ounces. Granted, it's different length, different caliber, but these are lighter weight while giving the same rugged durability that is what got the Rotex adopted so widely to begin with. And so these become just as popular with a wide variety of militaries, police agencies, large-scale manufacturers as the Rotex 3 had been. There is also, by the way, I want to point out a Rotex 2. The 2 is basically a sister of the 5. It's the same stamped baffle internals, but it has this rotating locking system instead of the NATO pattern lock. As a brief aside, in 2017, the US Marine Corps started a program to adopt the MARS, the Marine Assault Rifle Suppressor. And B&T was one of the companies that entered that program, and they did so with essentially a lightened version of the Rotex 5 with this specific adapter system for Marine Corps standards. Now, that program ends up being defunded and doesn't go anywhere, but B&T was part of it while it existed. Fast forward a couple more years to 2020, the Rotex 3 and the Rotex 5 are still both selling in significant large numbers. There are a lot of military forces in particular that have tested these, they've accepted them, and they're not interested in making changes. They like the product as it is, and they continue to order it because it's a known quantity. So these are still popular sellers, but there's a desire to simplify this NATO locking system. It is, frankly, a little complicated. It's got a lot of moving parts. And so that leads to the Rotex 10 or Rotex X, which is the same stamped baffle internal core, but they reduce the number of moving parts in this mount to basically 2. One safety lock and the gate. So much simpler system. You don't have all of this nonsense going on. Instead of a spring-loaded catch to prevent the can from screwing or unscrewing, you just have a little set spring there. So this I don't think ever became quite as popular as the Rotex 3 and 5 just because it hasn't been around as long, but it is a nice option if you want the military style rifle can, but you want something a little simpler and a little lighter. You can shave a bunch of weight off of this thing. The Rotex 10 is sort of the last iteration of this series as it was originally developed in like 2004. So a very long-lived project for B&T. All right, there's one really cool suppressor that I want to specifically talk about here, and that is the suppressor made for the MP9, aka the TP9. Now, flow-through or reduced back pressure is a term that we're starting to hear quite a lot these days. Like, it's the hot new thing, and it absolutely has become a subject of significant interest to militaries, largely for reasons of firearm reliability and health and safety. Toxic gas in the face is really not a good thing, weirdly. Well, back in 2001, B&T purchased this project from Steyr, and I will be posting a whole video on the evolution of the TPP, TP9, it's got a lot of different names, but we'll be posting a video on this. But part of the issue here is that in 2004, B&T wanted to adapt a suppressor. They wanted to design a suppressor to work with this pistol. This is a recoil-operated pistol that, you can just barely see it. The barrel's inside there. Gas pressure pushing back on the barrel had a very substantive effect on bolt velocity, and they were forced to have a reduced back pressure can in order for the gun to actually work properly. So today, we look at reduced pressure cans in terms of user comfort, getting gas in the face, rate of fire changes on machine guns, bolt velocity, having to have separate adjustable gas systems so that you have suppressed and unsuppressed modes. But back in 2004, B&T developed a reduced back pressure system because it was an operational necessity for this gun to just cycle correctly. And they did it, and it worked, and nobody apparently really thought much more of it for about 15 years. B&T came back. Of course, this sort of technology starts to become widely popular or widely known, starting with, I believe, OSS in about 2013. B&T came back to this system in 2019, specifically as a project with FN for a suppressor for the 249, the FN Mini-Me. The issue there was that the back pressure of a suppressor would substantially increase the rate of fire of the machine gun, the 249, resulting in reliability issues as well as excessive gas in the face of the shooters, which made the gun difficult to operate. But you're talking about like a 20% increase in rate of fire, which is really substantial. If you think about the issues that the M16 had in Vietnam, they were the result of changes in powder that caused an increased rate of fire, and that led to all sorts of cascading problems. Well, the same thing can happen with, say, a 249 Mini-Me with a suppressor on it. So B&T works with FN to develop a reduced back pressure system, and the way they do that is basically to take the modern Rotex with a stamped baffle core, and they add an extra sleeve around the outside of it. So internally, these two cans are basically the same thing, fundamentally the same thing, but the reduced back pressure one has this outside sleeve that gives gas essentially a bypass track, so that instead of building up pressure in the can, gas comes into this outside sleeve and vents through these front 4 holes. That becomes B&T's, the basis for B&T's reduced back pressure system, which they continue to iterate on. This one has a bunch of fancy flash suppressor elements on the front, as well as the Rotex 10 locking system. And it's kind of cool to me that for B&T, this wasn't catching up to the industry. This was looking back at something they'd done 15 years earlier and realizing that there was a new demand for the same concept, but now for different reasons. And that brings us to present day, where this whole Rotex series is being replaced at B&T by what they call the PrintX, which the cool thing, well, there are a bunch of cool elements. These are manufactured through 3D metal printing, which opens up a huge array of opportunities and options for manufacturers. So fundamentally, what the 3D printing allows them to do is go back to this more efficient baffle system, baffle design. Instead of those simple conical baffles, they can go back to one with a whole bunch of mechanical features like this, but these no longer have to be machined independently and then assembled into a suppressor. They can be printed as a complete self-contained unit. The system can be made even more complex. They can take this design and refine it a bit more beyond what was basically feasible to manufacture through traditional machining where you're removing metal, and instead modern additive manufacturing where you're building something up from scratch. So as a good example here, this is a 3D printed Inconel suppressor. This is the original Rotex 2 for the MP7 PDW. These two cans have basically the same suppression level. They're the same volume. The Rotex 2 comes in at just under 21.5 ounces. The PrintX in Inconel, not titanium, is just under 14 ounces, and it's a shorter can, but gives essentially the same level of suppression. So that's specifically for the MP7, but that is basically just a niche application of the general concept. And in fact, it also doesn't have the reduced back pressure system. So the standard cans going forward, the current version of the PrintX, like this is a 7.62 caliber can, and it incorporates the reduced back pressure systems. So if we go back to the original Rotex 10, you had a 40 millimeter tube, and the reduced back pressure system bumped it up to a 52 millimeter tube to have these outside, essentially bypass chambers. The same exact thing can be done on a 3D printed can, going from 40 millimeter up to 44 millimeter. So it's a far smaller can, which also means it's a much lighter can, but it's doing the same thing using chambers that are small enough that it wasn't feasible to manufacture them using traditional methods on the original RBS system. They also do the exact same designs, but 3D printed in titanium. So there are some trade-offs between titanium and Inconel in terms of both weight and cost and volume of fire capacity, like how many rounds you can put, dump through one of these cans in a machine gun before it starts to have structural issues. Inconel is better for sustained fire. Titanium is significantly lighter. We now have a can that weighs in at just under 10 ounces. 3D printed titanium with the reduced back pressure. Like, this is where suppressor technology is going. This isn't quite the most recent version. You can see a few little changes here. They realized with the disassembly flats like this, you could actually pinch yourself in the joint right there, so they move the flats up to the top. But titanium Inconel. This is exciting stuff. And I should also point out that all of these PrintX cans from B&T are hub compatible. So they have a standard internal thread pitch. It's 1.375 by, I don't remember the exact thread pitch, but it fits the universal hub system. So if, first off, you can buy muzzle device adapters from other companies as well as from B&T, although B&T, with their general company philosophy on customization and specialization, they have a huge catalog of hub adapter systems. But if you decide you want to use a different muzzle device, or you get a new rifle that has a different muzzle device on it, instead of being stuck with an original can where your muzzle adapter was welded in or otherwise fixed in place, you can keep the expensive part and just replace the hub. That's useful for militaries replacing guns. It's useful for individual private owners who want to run the same can on multiple different guns or want to try out different muzzle devices. This is actually, the hub is a standard that originated in the US, and B&T has jumped on that bandwagon because it really does make excellent sense from a modularity and a customer satisfaction point of view. It's really cool to see where the suppressor industry and where suppressor technology is going these days. 3D printing has really scaled up in its practicality. It was really not that long ago that 3D printers started as plastic, and I continue to think that their applications in plastic for the firearms industry are fairly limited. But 10 years ago, we could see the initial uses of 3D printing for prototyping, a way to make quick, rapid revisions to parts and get them printed out. And 10 years ago, the parts weren't high quality enough, they weren't dependable enough to make production models out of. But that has sure changed. I mean, yeah, I guess if you spent enough millions of dollars on a machine, even 10 years ago, you could get production quality, but it wasn't feasible. Today, the machinery technology has improved to the point that we have 3D printed suppressors that are absolutely cost competitive with traditionally manufactured ones. And at least as B&T sees it, that's the direction that the market is going, that they expect that the machined, hand-assembled suppressors are going to be less and less and less popular in lieu or in favor of 3D printed cans. They think that the reduced back pressure systems, which are already very close to catching up with traditional designs in terms of noise. Traditionally, as we said, the reduced back pressure means more noise. That gap is really narrowing, and B&T sees that gap being completely eliminated before too much longer. And the iterations on these designs are coming faster and faster and faster. And so it's really cool to see where they're going. All of these things are available currently, like everything you've seen in this video. Well, the new stuff you've seen in this video, you can't go buy one of these from them, but the new products are all available in the US as well as in Europe. Actually, I don't think I even mentioned it, but the production tooling, the machines, the 3D printers for B&T in Switzerland here and for B&T USA in the US are the exact same machines, deliberately purchased that way. They're the same material, printing from the same drawings. They're literally the exact same production in both places, which also makes it really handy because of US import-export laws make it very difficult to move suppressors in and out. So they just have dual identical production on both continents. So if you're interested in any of these, by all means, hit up B&T. If you're in Europe, they're in Thun. If you're in the US, there's B&T USA, and you can contact them as well. I do appreciate them being willing to pull out some of the really cool old stuff to show me, as well as some cool cutting-edge stuff. Like, I got to see some cutting-edge stuff that I can't even talk about on video yet, but it's pretty exciting what's coming next. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video as well. Thanks for watching.